Hello again. So I recently got some pretty great footage of a couple of Celestial Pearl Danios breeding, and instead of just posting that, I thought I'd put together a little video on how I was able to get them to successfully breed, in case that can be helpful to anyone who's struggling to do that at home. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the fun parts first, and then afterwards I'll talk details. So this pair was hanging out in my display tank, and I woke up one morning and saw them displaying the typical mating behaviors. And hopefully you can see some of that here in this video. You'll be looking for the male pretty aggressively pursuing the female. He'll have a bright neon yellow or orange stripe on the top of his head. His fins will be a little extra colorful compared to the norm. And he'll kind of follow her around, tip his head down, and vibrate his body. And he's trying to show her this stripe on the top of his head. That's a signal that he's at least ready to breed. And if she's adequately prepared, meaning she's been well fed, she's got some ripe eggs stored up inside of her, and she feels like they're in a suitable place to spawn, no problem. They'll go right at it. What you're seeing is footage of these fish within about 5 minutes of being netted out of the display tank and put into this little breeder box. And that's significant because it shows that even after a stressful experience like being netted out of a tank, if the conditions are right and they're ready, nothing will stop them from breeding. Okay, so I'm going to fast forward the video a little bit, and when it slows back down to normal speed, watch them close. Did you catch that? Now they're about to do it again, and this time I'm going to slow it down a little bit so that you can see better. And watch closely. Right after they release from each other, if you look underneath the female, you'll actually see the egg fall down from her body and then come to a rest on the divider. So there you go. We got an egg. And they look something like this. Within a few days, depending on temperature, they'll hatch into this tiny, almost invisible sliver. Looks like a piece of pencil lead with eyeballs. For the first few days after they hatch, they'll lie pretty motionless, either on the floor or clinging to the glass. And if you haven't seen this before, it can be a little nerve-wracking. You might think, hey, maybe they're dead. And probably they aren't, but at some point you would want to know. So you can just take a small pipette or a syringe, and if you just gently puff some water on them, if they're alive, they'll move. You don't want to abuse them, but it's important to know. You don't want something dead hanging out in your aquarium. A few more days, and they're up and swimming around looking for food. And at this point, they're kind of tough to feed because their mouths are so small. Personally, I fed mine using New Life Spectrum's fry powder. If you're using a breeding box, I would say that once they get to be free swimming, I would quickly remove them from there and get them into a small tank by themselves, because they will escape from the breeding box. That little overflow, they usually come with a small grate that looks like it'll stop things from getting out, but they're really small. And I've tried jamming a piece of filter material in there, but I found that a filter material that was fine enough to keep them from escaping at that young of an age was also fine enough to restrict the water flow. So I saw the water level in the breeding box kind of approaching the top, past where I was comfortable with. If it got clogged up with detritus, I could see it easily overflowing. After doing this a couple of times, I would now recommend actually removing the eggs from where they were laid using a small pipette or something, and then putting those eggs in the environment where you want them to hatch and live. It's a lot less stressful than trying to move the fry. I want to talk a little bit about a small modification I made to my breeding box that I thought worked a bit better. You can see one here if you look at the top water level. There's quite a bit of surface agitation, and that might not seem like a big deal, but let me show you what that looks like when you put spawning material in there. I personally use live moss. You can see if you look close how much that moss is rocking back and forth, and if you put a couple of small fish in there, they're going to rock back and forth just as much, and I don't think that that's good for the spawning process for a couple of reasons. One is, without going into gory detail, it makes the male's job harder, and two, I suspect that the female is looking for a place where the water is pretty calm, I think it's an instinct for them to pick a spot without fast-moving water that would just pick up and carry away those freshly hatched fry. That wouldn't end well for them. So what I did to remedy this situation is I removed the uplift tube and replaced it with flow coming from a very small, gentle, submersible pump, and that was routed into the breeding box with a small piece of flexible tubing attached to the side with a suction cup and angled down so that the water would flow directly through that long gap that runs the length of the divider. Bringing in water this way left the top of the breeding box pretty calm, which you can see here. This moss is holding still, and there's plenty of flow on the underside below the divider, which will really help to keep things clean. And you can see also that even turned way down, there's still plenty of water flow through here to keep the water clean for the breeding adults. So here's some of the fry a couple weeks in. They've grown quite a bit and things are getting easier because now they can accept larger foods. I'm feeding them the same fry powder still for some of the smaller ones, but also live baby brine shrimp, and their growth is really accelerating now that they can accept those live foods. For anyone wanting to know the boring details, the temperature of the water was about 75 degrees. pH was pretty neutral. It ranges for me between 6.8 and 7.2 during the day. The water is fairly soft, about 5 degrees of general hardness. I don't think that getting these to breed or keeping the fry alive is incredibly difficult, but most of what I've shown you is about how to do this in a breeding box, and my opinion now is that a breeding box really isn't the best way to do it in large numbers if that's what you're after. If you don't have room for a second tank, it might be a good idea, but the most productive spawning I've seen from these fish has been in a planted, not incredibly clean 20-gallon tank where they had a lot of room. I got lucky, I think, and just happened to remove the adults, I think, just before all the eggs hatched, but I pulled 30 or 40 of them out of this 20-gallon tank after the adults being in there for about a week. My future attempts at breeding will be in a more natural setting where I leave the adults in a planted and well substrated tank and just provide them a spot where they're likely to breed. In my experience, they seem to really prefer live moss, so I'll be doing the method where I contain that moss, provide it to them for spawning, and then remove it, hopefully with eggs intact. I think that's all the useful information I can provide at this point, but if you have any questions about something that I didn't address, please feel free to leave a question in the comments and I'll be happy to get back to you. So thanks for watching and good luck. Bye.